The floor was always vibrating. That is the first thing you forget when you leave, and the first thing that hits you when you return. It wasn't a tremble, it was a geological constant, the shivering of a world made entirely of iron and steam. For 14 hours a shift, my boots were locked into the grating of Sector 47, and my bones hummed in sympathy with the Great Press. You stop hearing the noise after the first year. The slamming of the pistons, the hiss of the coolant, the screaming of metal being forced into unnatural shapes, it all just becomes silence. It becomes the baseline of your existence. I liked that silence. It meant things were working. It meant I was useful. I was Pollux 719, and I was a good component. You would have felt the same pride. You know you would. To be part of something larger than yourself, even if that something is just a hydraulic stamp, pressing sheets of plasteel into casing for shells, you will never fire. Routine is a kind of armor. You wear it to keep the madness out. My routine was simple. Watch the feed, clear the debris, check the pressure gauge, repeat. Hydraulic press number 9 was my charge. She was old, temperamental leaking oil that smelled like burnt sugar and ancient rot. We had an understanding, her and I. I fed her, and she didn't take my fingers. That was the deal. The air in the factorum was thick enough to chew, tasting of ozone and recycled sweat. It coated your throat, making you cough up black phlegm at the end of every cycle. We called it hive lung, but we said it with a grin. It was the taste of industry, the taste of devotion. I remember looking at the chronometer on the wall, the hands jerking forward in staccato ticks. 2 hours left. Just 2 hours until the nutrient gruel and the sleep cycle. The rhythm was perfect. Click-clack. Hiss. Slam. It was the heartbeat of the Emperor himself, or so the preachers told us. I believed them. I didn't have a reason not to. Then the rhythm broke. It wasn't a loud noise. That's what they get wrong in the vids. Disasters don't always bang. Sometimes they just snap. It was a dry, hollow crack, like a branch stepping on a dead beetle. The piston on number 9 didn't retract. It stuttered. I did what I was trained to do. I reached for the manual override lever the safety protocol drilled into us since birth. My hand was on the lever. My other hand, my left hand, was clearing a piece of slag from the feeder tray. That was the mistake. Not the machine's. Mine. The piston didn't wait for the override. It slammed down. It didn't sound like metal hitting metal anymore. It sounded wet. I didn't feel the pain immediately. That's the mercy of the nervous system. It shuts down when the input is too high. I just felt the heat. A sudden, blinding white heat that started at my wrist and shot up through my shoulder, exploding behind my eyes. The world narrowed down to a single point of focus: my arm. It was trapped. The heavy iron of the press had descended, and the safety mag locks had engaged, sealing the machine shut. I tried to pull back. That was instinct. That was the animal brain trying to escape a trap. The pull brought the pain. It wasn't a sensation. It was a color. It was absolute white. It washed out the grime of the factory, the gray of the walls, the dim yellow of the lumen strips. I opened my mouth to scream, but the sound that came out was lost instantly in the roar of the other machines. They didn't stop. Why would they? The quota doesn't care about meat. The alarms finally triggered. Amber lights began to spin, casting long, nauseating shadows across the gantries. The siren was a dull, rhythmic hooting that seemed to mock the pounding of my own heart. I was on my knees, now my forehead pressed against the cold casing of number 9. I could smell it. Not the oil this time. I could smell the copper tang of blood and the sickeningly sweet scent of cooked meat. My meat. I looked up, vision blurring at the edges, waiting for a savior. I expected a medic. I expected a brother to pull me free. I expected mercy. Instead, I saw the foreman. He walked down the gantry, his heavy boots clanking with irritation, not urgency. He didn't run. You don't run on the factory floor. It's against regulation. He stopped beside me, looking down. He didn't look at my face. He didn't look at the tears cutting tracks through the grease on my cheeks. He looked at the machine. He looked at the hydraulic seal, where my forearm vanished into the mechanism. I saw him tap his Vox speed. I couldn't hear his words over the sirens, but I could read his lips. He wasn't calling for a stretcher. He was reporting a stoppage. He was reporting a jammed line. I was the jam. The realization hit me harder than the press had. I wasn't a victim to him. I was debris. I saw him reach for his belt, pulling out a pry bar. He gestured to two other workers who had gathered nearby. They hesitated. They looked at me, then at the foreman, then at their boots. They were ashamed, but they were also afraid. Fear is a powerful motivator, stronger than brotherhood. They stepped forward. The foreman shouted something about the timeline, about the production cycle. He jammed the pry bar into the release mechanism. It wasn't designed to be gentle. It was designed to force the jaws open just enough to clear an obstruction. Pull, the foreman mouthed. The two workers grabbed my shoulders. I shook my head. I tried to tell them to wait, that the bone was still caught, that they would tear me apart. But the noise swallowed my begging. The foreman cranked the lever. The press groaned, lifting a fraction of an inch. The pressure released for a microsecond, and the blood rushed back into the crushed limb, bringing a fresh wave of agony that made my vision go black. Then they pulled. They hauled me backward, with the desperate strength of men who wanted to get this over with. Something snapped. It felt like a wet branch breaking inside a heavy sack. I was free. I was on my back on the grating, sliding in a pool of my own fluids. I looked at my left arm. It ended in a ruin of red and white pulp. The sleeve of my coverall shredded and soaked. The machine number 9 was already resetting. The foreman was wiping the blood off the feeder tray with a rag. He hit the cycle button. Click, clack, hiss, slam. The rhythm returned. It didn't mourn. It didn't pause. The silence of the routine swallowed my scream once again. The world began to tilt. The ceiling of the factorum, usually so distant and obscured by smog, seemed to descend, crushing me. I felt hands on me again, lifting me onto a grav stretcher. Not gentle hands, efficient hands. They strapped me down. The ceiling light strobed past. 1, 2, 3, darkness. I tried to focus on something, anything, to anchor myself. The smell of ozone, the vibration of the floor, the sound of the press. It was still working. I had been removed, and it was still working. That was the horror. Not the injury, but the replaceability. The stretcher jolted, moving towards the bay doors. The last thing I saw was the foreman checking the pressure gauge, nodding to himself. The line was moving again. The darkness took the edges of my vision first, then the center. The pain became a dull, throbbing distance, like a storm on the horizon. I thought about the machine. I wondered if it missed me. I wondered if the next shell it stamped would carry a piece of me to the front lines. A part of me hoped so. It was a foolish hope. The metal doesn't care. The Emperor protects, they say. But down here in the guts of the manufactorum, the only thing that protects you is the quota. And I had failed it. The air grew colder as we left the factory floor. The noise faded, replaced by the high-pitched whine of the ambulance turbines. I closed my eyes. The silence stayed. The first thing that hits you isn't the sight of the suffering. It's the smell. You expect a hospital to smell clean, perhaps sharp with chemical astringents, but the St. Ignace Sanitarium smelled like a battlefield that had been scrubbed with acid and then left to rot. It was the smell of carbolic acid fighting a losing war against gangrene, unwashed bodies and ancient wet stone. It was a thick yellow taste in the back of your throat that made you want to gag, but you couldn't because you were too busy trying to breathe. The ambulance servitor shoved my stretcher out onto the receiving dock, with a mechanical indifference that rattled my teeth. The wheels caught on the uneven flagstones, sending a fresh spike of white-hot agony up my ruined arm. I gasped, arching my back, but the movement was lost in the cacophony. The air here was colder than the Factorum damp and heavy, clinging to the sweat that had turned cold on my skin. They call it a triage hall, but that implies a system of care. It was a warehouse of broken meat. The ceiling was lost in gloom, supported by pillars of dark granite that looked like the legs of some immense sleeping beast. Between those pillars lay hundreds of us, not dozens, hundreds. Rows upon rows of stretchers, pallets, and piles of rags forming a maze of misery. I saw men with burns that had fused their uniforms to their skin. I saw women clutching empty spaces where eyes or hands used to be. And beneath it all, a low, continuous drone of sound. It wasn't the screaming of the dying that came later in the wards. This was the low, rhythmic moaning of the waiting. It was a sound of patience born of terror. We were no longer citizens or workers. We were pending paperwork. I was pushed into a line. The queue moved with agonizing slowness, punctuated by a sound that I will hear in my nightmares until the day I die. Thump squish, thump squish. It was the sound of a heavy stamp hitting ink, then hitting flesh. At the head of the line sat a sister of the Order Hospitaller. You hear stories about them in the Shola Angels, in white armor, who bring the Emperor's mercy to the fallen. This was not an angel. She was a clerk in power armor. Her white ceramite was stained gray with smoke and old fluids. She didn't have a weapon. She had a heavy iron stamp and a data slate. She didn't look up. She didn't speak. She just processed. A trooper was dragged before her, his leg a mess of shrapnel. She glanced at it, tapped a key, and brought the stamp down on his forehead. Thump. Black ink. He was dragged to the left. My turn came. The stretcher locked into place before her lectern. For a second, I felt a surge of naive hope. I was a skilled worker. I was Pollux, 719 Grade 4 press operator. Surely that meant something. Surely the Imperium needed its machines manned. I tried to sit up to show her I was strong, but the straps held me down. She finally looked at me. Her face was gaunt, framed by the severe hood of her habit, her eyes shadowed and utterly empty of compassion. She didn't see a man in pain. She saw a resource calculation. Cost of repair versus remaining years of utility. Her gaze slid down to my arm, or what was left of it. The tourniquet the foreman had applied was soaked through black blood dripping onto the pristine floor. She watched the drop fall, irritated. Grade, her voice was like grinding stones, dry and devoid of inflection. Pollux 719, I croaked, my throat raw. Factorum Hestia, hydraulic press operator, I need to get back to the line. She didn't respond to my loyalty. She didn't even blink. She looked at the data slate, her finger hovering over the screen. Compound crush injury, potential nerve severance, high risk of sepsis. She spoke to the air, not to me. Reconstructive surgery required. Cost prohibitive for non-combat personnel. Please, I whispered. It hurts. Pain is the Emperor's test, she recited, automatic as a prayer wheel. She reached for the stamp. It looked heavy, made of brass and iron. She didn't aim for the paper. She aimed for my forehead. I flinched, but there was nowhere to go. Thump. The impact snapped my head back against the canvas pillow. I felt the cold wetness of the ink on my skin right above my eyes. I tried to look up to read my sentence in the reflection of her breastplate, but I couldn't focus. Priority 3. Non-urgent, she declared. Move him to the holding ward. Non-urgent, I shouted, the panic finally breaking through the shock. My arm is crushed, I'm bleeding. You are stabilized, she said, already looking at the next wretch behind me. You are not dying immediately. Therefore, you wait. Next, the servitor engaged the motors on my stretcher again. I was spun around, pulled away from the light of the desk and towards the gaping maw of a dark corridor to the right. I craned my neck, trying to catch her eye, trying to explain that there had been a mistake. I was essential. I was Pollux, but she was already stamping the next man. Thump. Red ink this time. Priority 1. He was screaming. I wasn't. That was my failure. I was quiet enough to be ignored. We rolled into the corridor. The air temperature dropped 10 degrees instantly. The walls here were bare plasteel sweating condensation. The noise of the triage hall faded behind heavy blast doors that hissed shut, cutting off the light. I was alone with the servitor and the rhythm of the wheels. I touched my forehead. The ink was still wet. It felt like a brand. Priority 3. It meant I was worth less than the ammo used to quell a riot. It meant I was inventory that might spoil before it could be shelved. I stared up at the passing lumen strips flickering and dying in the gloom. I realized then that the machine hadn't just taken my arm. It had taken my name. I wasn't Pollux anymore. I was just a priority 3. And I was going into the dark. The silence returned, but it was different this time. It wasn't the silence of the machine. It was the silence of the shelf. The silence of things put away to be forgotten. They call it a ward, but that is a word for a place of healing. Ward C Gamma was a storage facility for meat that hadn't quite spoiled yet. The doors hissed open, revealing a cavernous space bathed in a sickly submarine light. Bioluminescent algae tanks lined the upper walls, casting everything in a drowning green gloom. The air here didn't move. It hung heavy and humid, tasting of recycled breath, unwashed skin, and the copper tang of bed sores. There were no individual rooms. There were no curtains, just rows of metal bunks stacked 3 high, stretching into the dark, like shelves in a sepulcher. Every bed was full. Every bed made a sound, a chorus of wheezing, soft crying, and the rhythmic clatter of shivering teeth filled the space. It wasn't loud. It was a suffocating blanket of misery. The servitor dumped me onto a bottom bunk near the ventilation intake. The mattress was thin, little more than a sheet of canvas over a steel frame, and it was wet. Not damp from the humidity. Wet. A cold, sticky patch near the center told me exactly what had happened to the previous occupant and how quickly they had been removed. I didn't complain. You learn quickly that complaining draws the eye of the orderlies, and the orderlies carried shock batons, not bandages. I curled my legs up, trying to find a dry spot, cradling my ruined arm against my chest. Above me, the springs groaned. A face hung over the edge of the middle bunk, gaunt, gray-skinned eyes sunken into dark pits. This was Patient 718. He didn't say hello. He just looked at me with the flat, dead stare of a fish on a chopping block, then convulsed into a wet, rattling cough. A fine mist of spittle and sickness drifted down. I turned my face away, pressing it into the smelling pillow. This was my world now. An orderly marched down the aisle. He was a brute of a man wearing a butcher's apron over his fatigues, his face obscured by a rebreather mask. He stopped at my bed. He didn't check my pulse. He grabbed my good wrist, the right one. I flinched, but his grip was like iron. He held a heavy pistol-shaped device against my skin. There was no warning. Ka-chunk. A sharp, stinging bite drove into my wrist bone. I gasped, tears pricking my eyes. He released me and moved on to the next bed. I looked down. A strip of stamped tin had been stapled directly into my flesh. Pollux, 719, C Gamma, P3. It wasn't a bracelet. It was a tag. I was no different than the sheet metal I used to stamp. I was inventory. Night in the ward is a relative term. The green lights never go out. They just dim to a murky twilight. The silence is never real. It is a tapestry of sounds that tells you too much about the people around you. To my left, A woman prayed ceaselessly to the God Emperor, her voice a broken whisper that rose and fell with her pain. To my right, someone was weeping, a soft hitching sound that eventually faded into sleep or death. Above me, 718 kept coughing. Every time he moved, the bunk creaked, and I tensed, waiting for fluids to drip down. I lay there staring at the underside of his mattress, tracing the rust stains on the metal springs. I tried to remember the rhythm of the press, click-clack. But the rhythm was gone. It was replaced by the vox casters mounted on the walls, which crackled to life every hour. Suffering is the currency of the faithful. The vox distorted a recorded voice loop that had probably been playing for centuries. Endurance is your tithe. I closed my eyes. The pain in my arm was a throbbing sun, hot and angry, but the pain in my mind was worse. It was the realization that the factorum didn't stop because I was gone. The city didn't care. I was just a broken cog in a bin of broken cogs, waiting to be melted down or hammered back into shape. I touched the cold metal staple in my wrist. It was the only thing that felt real. The woman stopped praying. The weeping stopped, but the coughing above me continued. I didn't move. Time became a liquid thing, pooling and dripping like the condensation on the walls. I think it had been 3 days. It's hard to tell when the lights never change and you drift in and out of a fever sleep. But I knew time was passing because my arm had changed. The numbness was gone, replaced by a deep, throbbing heat that felt like a coal was buried in the meat of my forearm. And there was a new smell. Beneath the carbolic acid and the unwashed bodies, a sickly sweet scent was rising from the bandages. It smelled like overripe fruit left in the sun. It smelled like the dead rats we sometimes found in the ventilation shafts. I tried to keep my arm away from my face, but the smell was heavy. It settled in the back of my throat and coated my tongue. He finally came on the 3rd shift. Not an orderly with a baton, but a chirurgeon, a man of science, or what passes for it in the dark. He didn't walk. He glided, his red robes trailing over the filth of the floor, the hem stained black with old fluids. He wasn't like us. Half his face was gone, replaced by a bronze mask that hissed with every breath. Where his right eye should have been, a multi-lens optical implant, whirred and rotated, zooming in and out with a sharp, rhythmic click. That sound, it froze the blood in my veins. It was the same click the press made before it stamped. It was the sound of assessment, the sound of judgment. He stopped at my bed. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He didn't introduce himself. To him, I wasn't a patient. I was a malfunctioning unit. A servo arm extended from his backpack, holding a bright, cold light that blinded me. With his organic hand, gaunt pale and impossibly strong, he ripped the crusted bandage away from my arm. The skin underneath peeled with it. I screamed. It was a raw animal noise that I couldn't hold back. The chirurgeon didn't even flinch. He didn't pause. He leaned in the red lens of his eye, spinning click-whir-click, scanning the blackened, swollen flesh. Significant necrosis, he intoned. His voice was synthesized flat and metallic, bypassing his throat entirely to emerge from a grill on his collar. Secondary infection. Pseudomonas strains evident. He reached out with a pair of silver forceps. He didn't probe gently. He dug. He pushed the cold metal deep into the wound to test the bone density. I arched off the mattress, my vision whitening my teeth, grinding together until I thought they would crack. Please, I gasped, sweat stinging my eyes. Stop, it hurts. He ignored me. He withdrew the forceps, wiping the pus onto his robe. He tapped a command into his data slate. Tissue viability is below acceptable parameters for regeneration. What does that mean? I managed to wheeze. Can you fix it? Can I go back to the line? The chirurgeon finally looked at my face. The red lens dilated, focusing on my sweating, terrified brow. "The unit requires processing," he said to the air. "Schedule for debridement. If failure continues, excise. Processing." The word hung in the air, cold and terrible. "Wait, what do you mean, excise?" But he was already turning away. The servo arm retracted the light. The red robe swirled. Click, whir, click. He moved to the next bed, leaving me alone in the dim green light. The pain in my arm was worse now, agitated and angry, but the cold knot in my stomach was new. Processing. You process ore. You process corpses into starch. You don't process people. Unless they aren't people anymore. I stared at the ceiling. The silence stayed. They call it waiting, but that implies a pause. It implies a gap between events where nothing happens. In C-Gamma, waiting is an activity. It is a slow, grinding war of attrition fought in silence. 4 more days passed. Or maybe 5. I stopped counting the light cycles and started counting the meals. The food came once a day, a ladle of gray, lukewarm paste that smelled of algae and chemical preservatives. We call it corpse starch. In the hive, a joke we tell to scare the new workers. Here, looking at the faces of the men eating it, the joke didn't seem so funny. It tasted of nothing. Yet it left a film of grease on the roof of your mouth that no amount of water could wash away. I learned quickly not to eat it all at once. I learned to wrap half of it in a scrap of bandage and hide it under my hip. Not for later. But because if you eat too fast, the man in the next bunk hears the spoon scraping the bowl, and he starts to plan. The man across the aisle, 3 beds down, he didn't look at my face anymore. He looked at my feet. I was still wearing my Factorum boots, heavy steel-toed leather reinforced for industrial accidents. In here, where most people were barefoot or wrapped in bloody rags, those boots were a king's ransom. I saw him whispering to the patient next to him, his eyes darting to my ankles. I stopped taking them off to sleep. My feet swelled inside them, the leather biting into my skin, cutting off circulation, but I kept the laces tight. I knew that if I closed my eyes for too long, I would wake up barefoot. And in this cold, with the filth on the floor, to be barefoot was to die. The smell changed again. The sharp sting of carbolic acid had retreated, defeated by the overwhelming stench of the ward itself. It was a cocktail of human waste, unwashed bodies, and the sickly sweet rot of gangrene. My own arm was contributing to the symphony now. I could smell myself. It was a horrifying intimacy to be trapped in a small space with your own decaying flesh. But the worst smell came from above. Patient 718, the coughing had stopped 2 shifts ago. At first I was grateful for the silence. I thought he had finally fallen asleep. Then the fluids started dripping through the mattress again, but this time they were cold. They came for him during the sleep cycle. No prayers, no priests, just 2 orderlies with a heavy black body bag. They didn't treat him like a person. They handled him like a sack of wet laundry. One grabbed the shoulders, the other the feet. They swung him off the top bunk. He hit the floor with a heavy wet thud that shook the frame of my bed. I squeezed my eyes shut, pretending to be asleep, my hand gripping the hidden ration bar under my hip. I heard the zip of the bag, the screech of the cartwheels. 10 minutes later, before the mattress above me had even dried, a new shadow was thrown onto it. A new weight made the springs groan. A new voice started to whimper in the dark. The system didn't pause. It didn't mourn. It just reloaded. I lay there in the dark, listening to the new guy cry. I didn't feel sad for 718. I didn't even know his name. I just felt a cold, hard knot of jealousy. He was out. He was done. I was still here guarding my boots and rotting by the minute. I didn't move. I just tightened my laces. They didn't wake me. I was already awake, listening to the wet rasp of my own breathing, when the hands grabbed me. There were 2 of them, orderlies, with arms the size of pistons, and faces hidden behind wire mesh visors. They didn't speak. They didn't check my chart. They just hauled me up by the armpits, my feet scrabbling for purchase on the slick floor. I tried to ask where we were going, but my throat was so dry, it only produced a dry click. They dragged me down the central aisle past the rows of watching eyes. No one helped. No one even sat up. In the ward, when the orderlies come for someone else, you don't intervene. You just thank the throne it isn't you. But this time, it was me. They kicked open a heavy blast door at the far end of the ward, and the smell hit me instantly. It wasn't the rot of the sleeping quarters. It was sharper metallic and chemical, like the solvent tanks in the factorum, mixed with the copper reek of fresh blood. The room was small, little more than a converted storage closet, with a drain set into the center of the tiled floor. The tiles were stained a deep, permanent brown. In the center sat a metal chair with leather restraints that looked black and shiny from years of use and grease. They shoved me into it. I didn't fight. You don't fight men like that. They buckled the straps across my chest and my good wrist, cinching them tight enough to bruise. Then they took my left arm, the ruined one, and strapped it to a steel tray extending from the armrest. The metal was freezing against my feverish skin. A figure turned from the counter. It wasn't the high-ranking chirurgeon with the red eye. It was a menial, a lower-caste medical servant, wearing a butcher's apron that was stiff with dried gore. He held a tray of instruments. They weren't surgical tools. They were pliers, wire brushes, and hooked scrapers. Necrotic tissue removal. The menial muttered, his voice muffled by a dirty surgical mask. He didn't look at me. He looked at the purple swollen mass of my forearm. Debridement required. Hold him. Wait, I gasped, pulling at the chest strap. The anesthetic. You haven't given me the anesthetic. The orderly on my right laughed. It was a short barking sound like a cough. Anesthetic is for officers, he said. You get the Emperor's grit. The menial didn't wait for the conversation to finish. He picked up a pair of shears and cut away the remaining dead skin hanging from the wound. That didn't hurt. The nerve endings there were already gone. But then he picked up the scraper. It looked like a tool we used to clean slag off the engine blocks. He poured a bottle of clear, stinging liquid over my arm. It fizzed and smoked as it hit the infection, and then he began to dig. He wasn't gentle. He drove the metal hook into the soft, rotting meat of my forearm and pulled. I thought I knew pain. I thought the press crushing my arm was the ceiling of agony. I was wrong. This was intimate. This was slow. I felt the metal grate against the ulna bone. I felt the healthy tissue tearing as he ripped the dead flesh away. I threw my head back and screamed. It wasn't a brave scream. It was a high, jagged noise that scraped my vocal cords raw. I thrashed in the chair, the leather biting into my skin, my legs kicking uselessly at the table. The orderlies just leaned their weight on my shoulders, pinning me down. The menial didn't stop. He scraped and pulled, throwing wet chunks of gray matter into a bucket at his feet. Plop. Plop. The sound was deafening in the small room. Above us, a small Vox speaker bolted to the ceiling continued to drone the hourly litany. Pain is the wine of communion. Drink deep and be made holy. The words twisted in my mind, mocking me. I didn't feel holy. I felt like an animal being field-dressed while it was still breathing. I begged them to stop. I promised them credits I didn't have. I promised to work double shifts. I called for my mother. I called for the Emperor. The menial just poured more of the acid wash over the raw, exposed muscle. The chemical burned like liquid fire, searing the nerves that he had just exposed. Almost done, the menial said in the same tone a mechanic might use when tightening a bolt. He used the pliers next. He dug deep into the wound to pull out a shard of bone, or perhaps a piece of metal from the accident that had been festering there. I couldn't see. My vision had grayed out, tunneling down to a pinprick of light. I could hear the wet, tearing sound of the pliers slipping on something slick. I bit through my lip. I tasted copper. The scream died in my throat, replaced by a ragged, sobbing gasp. Then abruptly it stopped. The pressure released. The menial wiped his instruments on a rag and tossed them back onto the tray with a clatter. "Bandage him," he ordered. The orderlies wrapped the raw, bleeding mess in rough gauze that felt like sandpaper. They unbuckled the straps. I slumped forward, unable to hold my own weight, retching dryly onto the tiled floor. They didn't let me rest. They hauled me up again, my legs dragging like dead weights. They threw me back onto my bunk in the ward. I lay there trembling uncontrollably, cradling the fresh agony of my arm. The numbness was gone. The fever was gone, replaced by a cold clarity of pain that sharpened every sense. I could hear the drip of the water. I could hear the breathing of the man next to me. I looked at the ceiling, my eyes burning. I had been cleaned. I had been purified. But as I lay there listening to the silence of the ward, I knew they hadn't cut out just the rot. They had cut out something else, the part of me that believed in mercy. It wasn't mercy, it was calibration. The cleaning didn't work. If anything, it woke something up. That night the heat came back, but it wasn't the dull warmth of a healing wound. It was a furnace fire raging beneath the bandages. My left arm felt heavy, swollen to twice its size. The skin stretched so tight I thought it would split like an overripe fruit. I lay in the dark, sweating into the canvas mattress, shivering so hard my teeth rattled in my skull. The fever changed the room. The green bioluminescent lights of the algae tanks didn't look like lights anymore. They looked like eyes. Thousands of unblinking, sickly green eyes staring down from the ceiling, watching the meat spoil. The air grew thick, turning into a soup of shadows that moved when I turned my head. I saw figures standing at the foot of the bunks, tall, robed shapes with too many limbs. But when I blinked, they dissolved back into the gloom. The sounds of the ward began to distort. The rhythmic dripping of the condensation became the hiss of the factory steam valves. Hiss, thump, hiss. I was back at the press, but the press was made of bone, and the oil was blood. I tried to close my ears, but my hands were too heavy. Then I heard the clicking. It started low, a dry, sharp sound, like stones knocking together. Click, click, click. It wasn't the machine. It was coming from the bed directly opposite mine. The man who had eyed my boots. The man who had whispered about stealing my rations. He was sitting up rigid as a board, staring at the empty air between us. "It's in the walls," he whispered. His voice wasn't his own. It was wet and bubbling like he was speaking through a mouthful of water. "Can't you hear them scratching? Chewing?" "Shut up!" I managed to rasp my tongue, feeling like a piece of dry leather. "You'll wake the orderlies." He didn't hear me. He started to scratch at his own throat, his fingernails digging deep into the grime-caked skin, drawing lines of dark blood. "They are in the marrow," he giggled, a sound that made my skin crawl. "The grandfather is knocking." The clicking got louder. I realized with a jolt of nausea that it wasn't his fingers, it was his teeth. His jaw was vibrating, chattering with such force that I could hear the enamel chipping. Click, 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 click. It sounded exactly like the optical lens of the chirurgeon. It sounded like the countdown of a bomb. He wasn't just sick. This wasn't gangrene or fever. This was something else. Something that the priests warned us about in hushed tones during the long shifts. The corruption that doesn't just rot the flesh, but rots the soul. He convulsed, then his back arching off the mattress in an impossible curve, his heels drumming a frantic tattoo on the metal frame. Foam began to spill from his lips. It wasn't white. It was a dark, iridescent green glowing faintly in the gloom. It bubbled down his chin, dripping onto his chest. The smell hit me sweet, cloying like lilies on a grave, mixed with the stench of an open sewer. Panic, cold, and absolute washed away my fever for a second. I pressed myself back against the wall, trying to disappear, trying to put as much distance as possible between me and the thing that was happening 3 feet away. I pulled my knees to my chest, covering my mouth with my good hand. If I breathed it in, I was dead. If they thought I was part of it, I was dead. "Help someone further down the row," screamed, finally breaking the code of silence. "He's turning throne, save us." "He's turning." The man opposite me collapsed back onto the bed, his body going limp, but the clicking didn't stop. His jaw kept working, grinding even as his eyes rolled back into his head. The green foam pooled on the floor, sizzling softly where it touched the cold stone. I stared at it, mesmerizing and terrified. It was spreading. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was waiting for a reaction. The green light died, instantly replaced by a rotating crimson klaxon that bathed the ward in the color of arterial blood. The Vox litanies cut out. There was no static, just a high-pitched, piercing whine that vibrated in the fillings of my teeth. Then came the sound of heavy locks engaging. Clang, clang, clang. The blast doors at both ends of the ward sealed us in. We weren't patients anymore. We were containment. The air filtration system reversed with a groan, sucking the air out of the room to prevent the spread of airborne pathogens. My ears popped. The sudden drop in pressure made the man opposite me, the one with the green foam, gasp, his back arching as if pulled by invisible strings. He was the epicenter. And we were in the blast radius. The side door, the one used for waste disposal, hissed open. They didn't send doctors. They didn't send priests. 3 figures stepped into the red gloom. They wore heavy, rubberized environmental suits that obscured every inch of humanity, their faces hidden behind black glass visors. They carried tanks on their backs, and in their hands they held heavy, nozzle-tipped weapons. Flamers. Promethium incinerators. They moved with a practiced, tactical efficiency. They didn't sweep the room. They knew exactly where the target was. They marched down the central aisle, their boots thumping heavily on the stone, ignoring the wails of the patients, shrinking back into their bunks. I pressed myself so flat against the wall, I felt the cold dampness soak through my shirt. I stopped breathing. If I breathed, they might see me. If they saw me, they might think I was part of the rot. They stopped at the bed of the convulsing man. One of the soldiers raised a gloved hand. Contagion confirmed a voice crackled from his external speaker. It was flat board even. Purge protocols engaged. There was no prayer. No last rites. The soldier on the left squeezed the trigger. There was a sound, like a sudden intake of breath, whoosh, and then a roar. A lance of liquid fire erupted from the nozzle engulfing the bed, the mattress, and the man. He didn't have time to scream. The sound of the fire was too loud, a hungry, crackling roar that consumed the oxygen in the immediate area. The heat washed over my face, blistering and intense, drying the sweat on my forehead in an instant. I smelled it then. It wasn't the smell of cooked pork that you imagine. It was the smell of burning hair melting synthetic fabric and the deep, oily stench of charred bone. It smelled like the factory floor when a motor burns out, but sweeter. Sickeningly sweet. The fire died as quickly as it had started, leaving behind a blackened, smoking crater where a human being had been seconds ago. The metal frame of the bunk glowed cherry red in the dark. The soldier checked a gauge on his weapon. "Sanitized," he reported. They turned and marched out their heavy footsteps, fading into the corridor. The blast doors hissed open. The red lights cut out, and the sickly green gloom returned, as if nothing had happened. The ventilation kicked back on trying to scrub the smoke from the air, but the smell remained. It clung to the walls. It clung to my throat. I looked at the empty, smoldering space across the aisle. No one spoke. No one cried. We all understood the lesson. In this place, sickness is a crime, and the punishment is absolute. The smoke settled. They didn't wait for the smoke to clear from the ward. The air scrubbers were still whining, trying to filter out the smell of the burning man when the orderlies returned. They didn't bring breakfast. They brought a gurney. This time, they didn't drag me. They lifted me with a grim efficiency that terrified me more than violence. Violence is personal. This was logistical. I was moved from the humid, rotting twilight of the ward into a corridor of blinding, aggressive white. The light in the operating theater wasn't illumination. It was an assault. It stabbed into my eyes, washing out the shadows, leaving nowhere to hide. The air here was frigid, scrubbed so clean, it smelled of absolutely nothing. Not even the memory of a scent remained. It was a void. They strapped me to a table. It was a slab of stainless steel, angled slightly downward, so fluids would drain away from the head. I felt the cold bite into my back through the thin fabric of my hospital gown. The restraints were heavy leather, reinforced with plasteel weave. They clamped my ankles, my chest, and my right arm. My left arm, the reason I was here, was pulled out to the side, strapped onto a separate metal wing. It looked alien to me now. Purple-black and swollen, leaking yellow fluid through the dirty bandages. It didn't feel like part of my body anymore. It felt like a parasite that was slowly killing the host. The chirurgeon entered. I recognized the hum of his optics before I saw him. Click whir. He was surrounded by servitors, mindless drones with saws and drills where their hands should be. He didn't look at me. He looked at the monitors above my head, his mechanical eye spinning as it digested the data. Necrosis has breached the elbow joint. He stated, his voice flat and distorted by the grill in his throat. Systemic infection imminent. The limb is irredeemable. Irredeemable. The word hung in the cold air. It wasn't a medical diagnosis. It was a moral judgment. I wanted to beg. I wanted to promise that I could heal, that I was strong, that I was faithful. But my tongue felt like lead. I was too tired. The fear that had kept me awake for a week had burned itself out, leaving behind a hollow gray ash of resignation. I just watched him. He nodded to a servitor. The drone moved forward, its heavy tread rolling silently on the pristine floor. One of its arms extended. It wasn't a scalpel. It was a circular bone saw, the teeth gleaming with oil. I heard the motor spin up. It started as a low growl, then rose to a high-pitched scream that vibrated in the metal of the table. Whirr. It sounded exactly like the hydraulic press in Sector 47 when it was running at full capacity. The rhythm of my life was ending exactly how it began, with the sound of a machine doing its job. Anesthetic, the assistant asked, holding a syringe. The chirurgeon paused, his red eye flickering over the readouts. Resource allocation is low, he said. The patient is in shock. It is not necessary. I felt a pinch in my neck, but it wasn't relief. It was a paralytic. I felt my legs go heavy, then my chest. I couldn't move. I couldn't turn my head. But I could still see. I could still feel. The saw lowered. The noise filled the room, drowning out the hum of the ventilation. I stared at the ceiling lights, counting the rivets in the metal plates. 1, 2, 3. The vibration hit my shoulder first. A violent, shaking shudder that rattled my teeth. Then came the pressure. Not pain, not yet. Just a terrible, overwhelming pressure, as if the entire weight of the manufactorum was pressing down on a single line of bone. The sound changed. The high-pitched whine deepened to a grinding roar as the teeth bit into something solid. I tried to scream, but the paralytic held my throat in a vice. I could only stare wide-eyed at the white light tears leaking from the corners of my eyes, running cold into my ears. The machine didn't hate me. It was just correcting an error. I was the error. Then the world tilted. The pressure snapped. The roar of the saw spun down into a freewheeling whine. Darkness rushed in from the edges of my vision, a merciful heavy tide. I didn't feel the blade leave. I just felt the weight go. I was lighter, and I was gone. I woke up to the smell of oil. Not the burnt, dirty oil of the factory floor, but the sharp, sterile scent of holy unguents and machine lubricant. The white light of the operating theater was gone, replaced by the flickering amber of a lumen strip dangling from a chain. I was in a recovery bay, but it felt more like a workshop. The walls were lined with racks of spare parts, pistons, gears, cables hanging like cuts of meat in a butcher shop. I tried to sit up. My body felt heavy, lopsided, as if gravity had shifted its axis. A dull ache throbbed in my left shoulder, deep and hollow, like a tooth that had been pulled, but left the nerve exposed. I reached across to touch it, expecting bandages, expecting the stump. My hand didn't touch skin. It touched cold, rough iron. I froze. I looked down. Where my arm had been, the arm that had fed the press, the arm that had a scar from a childhood fall, the arm that was mine. There was now a construct of gray metal. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't the shining chrome limbs you see on the statues of the Astartes. It was a crude industrial tool. A thick piston replaced my forearm. Cables sheathed in black rubber snaked down from a bolted plate in my shoulder, mimicking muscles, but looking like guts. The hand was a claw, 3 thick, flat fingers of darkened steel, designed for gripping, not for feeling. It lay on the bedsheet like a dead weight, a foreign object that had been welded to my soul. Neural integration at 84%, a voice rasped from the shadows. A tech priest stepped forward. He was more machine than man, his red robes draped over a chassis of brass and wire. He held a device connected to my new shoulder by a thick data cable. He didn't look at my face. He was watching the twitching of the metal fingers. The spirit of the machine is reluctant. Your flesh resists. It's heavy, I whispered, the horror rising in my throat like bile. I tried to lift it. The motor at my elbow whined a high, thin keen, and the arm jerked upward, smashing into the side of the bed frame with a loud clang. I didn't feel the impact. I heard it. That was the worst part. The feedback loop was broken. I saw the violence, I heard the noise, but my brain received no signal of pain or touch. Just a dull vibration in the bone. Calibration required, the tech priest muttered, twisting a screw on the wrist joint with a rusted driver. Pain is irrelevant. Function is mandatory. Open the manipulator. I concentrated. I tried to remember what it felt like to open my hand. I sent the command down a nervous system that now ended in a microprocessor. Work click. The 3 metal fingers snapped open with the force of a bear trap. It wasn't a hand. It was a clamp. I looked at my right wrist at the thin strip of tin stapled into my flesh. Pollux, 719. Then I looked at the left. Stamped into the gray metal casing was a serial number, Unit 7 Kappa Refurb. I swallowed, my mouth dry. Is it permanent? The tech priest paused, his mechadendrite swaying behind him like a metal cobra. He looked at me with optics that glowed a cold, indifferent blue. Flesh decays. Iron is eternal. You have been improved. You are closer to the motive force now than you ever were as a sack of meat. He yanked the data cable free from the port in my shoulder. Stand. I slid off the table. The weight of the arm pulled me to the left, throwing me off balance. I stumbled, the metal claw scraping against the wall. Scritch! It sounded like nails on a chalkboard. I looked at the limb hanging dead at my side until I willed it to move. It wasn't me. It was a tool that I was attached to. I felt a wave of revulsion so strong I wanted to tear it off, to rip the bolts from my bone and bleed out on the floor. But I didn't. I couldn't. It was part of me now. Functional, the tech priest declared, turning back to his workbench. Go, the line waits. I stood there listening to the hum of the servos in my own shoulder. The silence of the room wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the sound of my own body. The loop closed. I found myself back in the cavernous triage hall, standing on the same flagstones where I had bled 2 weeks ago. The smell was the same, that choking yellow reek of carbolic acid and fear, but it didn't make me gag anymore. It smelled like clarity. The lines of the wounded were still there, a river of misery flowing towards the desk, but I was swimming upstream now. I was walking towards the exit. I wasn't on a stretcher. I was on my feet, though I listed to the left, pulled down by the 10 pounds of dead weight, bolted to my shoulder. An orderly tossed a bundle at me. It was my coverall, stiff with dried sweat, and the brown stain of my own blood on the left sleeve. And my boots. My beautiful steel-toed boots. I clutched them to my chest, with my good arm feeling a sudden absurd spike of gratitude. They were the only things in this entire hive that belonged to me. Dressing was a battle. The left sleeve of my coveralls was too narrow for the piston-driven bulk of the new limb. I had to rip the fabric, hearing the threads snap one by one to force the metal claw through. It hung there, protruding from the ragged cloth like a scavenged part on a broken engine. I laced my boots with one hand and 3 steel pincers. It was clumsy, slow work. The metal fingers didn't have the sensitivity to feel the laces. They just crushed them. I pulled too hard and the aglet snapped. I stared at it. I didn't feel frustration. I didn't feel anger. I just felt a cold, gray acceptance. I tucked the frayed lace in. It would hold. It had to. I stood before the lectern. The Sister of the Order Hospitaller was still there, eternal and unchanging like a gargoyle carved from white ceramite. She was stamping forms with the same rhythmic violence. Thump. Thump. She didn't look up as I approached. To her, I was just another file moving from the pending stack to the resolved stack. I waited. The silence between us stretched, filled only by the distant moans of the new arrivals behind me. I realized then that I wasn't one of them anymore. I wasn't a victim. I was a product that had passed quality control. "Name?" she asked, her voice dragging like a chain over gravel. She didn't check the data slate. She already knew the answer was irrelevant. "Pollock 719, I said. My voice sounded deeper, hollowed out by the screams I had left in the operating theater. She paused, her quill hovering over the parchment. She glanced, just for a flicker of a second, at the gray metal hanging at my side. There was no pity in her eyes. There was only efficiency. Prosthetic integration. Model 7. Functional. I recited the words, tasting like ash. Pain levels. Manageable. It was a lie. The connection port in my shoulder felt like it was burning, but I knew the correct answer. The Imperium has no use for pain, only for results. "Fit for service," she declared. Her hand moved in a blur. The heavy iron stamp came down on my discharge papers. Thump. The sound echoed in the hollow of my chest. It was the sound of a prison door opening, not to let me out, but to let me into a bigger yard. She shoved the papers toward me. Next, the heavy blast doors at the end of the hall ground open. I stepped through them, leaving the yellow light of the hospital behind. The air of the hive city hit me like a physical blow. It was freezing, carrying the biting taste of ozone promethium exhaust and the acidic rain that falls constantly from the upper spires. It didn't smell like antiseptic. It smelled like industry. It smelled like the grind. I stood on the loading dock, the wind whipping my torn sleeve against the metal of my new arm. Clink. Clink. I looked out at the skyline. The manufactorums were dark mountains of iron against the bruised purple sky, belching fire into the clouds. Somewhere out there, in Sector 47, press number 9 was waiting. It was hungry, and I was going back to feed it. I looked at the stamp on my paper. Fit for service. I flexed the metal claw, listening to the servos whine. I wasn't a man who had been healed. I was a component that had been refurbished. I started walking into the dark. There was nowhere else to go. The factory floor hadn't changed. That was the first truth I had to swallow. After 2 weeks of hell, after the screaming and the cutting and the smell of burning meat, I expected the world to look different. I expected a scar on the place where I had been broken. But Sector 47 was exactly as I had left it. The air was still a gray haze of oil vapor and recycled sweat. The light still flickered with the inconsistent pulse of the generator. And the noise was a physical weight that pressed against your chest. Slam, hiss, grind. It was the same song played on an infinite loop, but the way I heard it had changed. Before, it was a noise I endured. Now, with the heavy, dull vibration of the bionic limb humming against my ribs, it felt like a frequency I was tuned into. I walked down the gantry, my boots ringing on the grating. I didn't flinch at the steam vents. I didn't cough. I felt a strange, cold calm settling over me. I wasn't returning to a workplace. I was slotting back into a socket. The foreman was waiting at the head of the line. He held a data slate, his eyes scanning the output metrics of the shift. He didn't look up when I approached. He just saw the shadow of the metal arm falling across his screen. He stopped. He looked at the limb first. He inspected the welds, the thickness of the piston, the grease on the joints. He nodded a tight, approving motion. He didn't ask if I was in pain. He didn't ask if I could sleep. He looked at the machine attached to my shoulder and saw an upgrade. Standard pattern, he grunted, tapping the slate. Good torque, durable. You can run the press at 110% capacity now. The flesh used to tire. That won't. Yes, foreman, I said. My voice was flat. I didn't feel the sting of his indifference anymore. Why should I? He was right. The flesh was weak. The flesh had failed. The metal was strong. He pointed a gloved finger toward the line. Station 9. Back to work. You owe the quota for 2 weeks of downtime. I walked to press number 9. She was there, looming in the smog, a monolith of iron and grease. My blood had been scrubbed from the feeder tray, but I could still see the faint dark staining in the grooves of the metal. A new worker was standing there, a young kid with terrified eyes struggling to keep up with the rhythm. He saw me coming, a gaunt, gray-skinned ghost with a claw of iron, and he scrambled out of the way without a word. I stepped into the operator's cradle. It felt like coming home. I reached out with my right hand to the control panel. Then I reached out with my left. The metal claw clicked against the steel lever. Clink. It was a perfect fit. Cold on cold. Hard on hard. There was no softness of skin to cushion the contact. I was directly connected to the machine. I engaged the cycle. The press roared to life. Click-clack. Hiss. Slam. The vibration traveled up the lever, through the iron claw, up the piston forearm, and into the bolt anchored in my shoulder. It didn't hurt. It felt correct. It felt like a circuit closing. I fed the plasteel sheet. I pulled the lever. I cleared the debris. I did it faster than I had ever done before. The fatigue that used to burn in my left shoulder after the first hour never came. The bionic limb didn't ache. It didn't cramp. It just worked. It whirred and hissed in perfect counterpoint to the press. I wasn't fighting the machine anymore. I was part of the transmission. Hours passed. The shift whistle blew, but I didn't stop immediately. I finished the cycle. I looked down at my hands. One was pink-scarred, covered in grime, trembling slightly with exhaustion. The other was gray, unyielding, pristine in its oily sheen. I looked at the flesh hand with a sudden detached sense of disgust. It looked so fragile, so soft. It was the part of me that could bleed. It was the part of me that could feel fear. But the left side was pure. I realized then that the chirurgeon hadn't taken something away from me. He had given me a gift. He had shown me the future. I looked around the factory floor at the thousands of other souls toiling in the gloom, their bodies breaking slowly under the weight of the Emperor's wars. They were still meat. They were still suffering. I stood there, the steam curling around my iron fingers, and I felt a terrible cold kind of peace. I wasn't Pollock 719 anymore. That man had died on the stretcher. I was something else, something efficient, something that would survive. I turned off the press. The silence rushed back in, but it wasn't empty. It was waiting for the next shift. I wiped the oil from my metal claw with a rag, the movement smooth and mechanical. I didn't dream of the sky that night. I didn't dream of the pain. I didn't dream at all. The war would continue. It always did. And now, finally, I was built for it.